This week, welcome to Redirect Immigration Law and Perspectives. My name is Stephen Robbins. I'm an immigration attorney out here in Yakima, Washington. And this week, Matthew, our beloved co-host, is not with us. He had a hearing today. And if you've ever had an immigration hearing, you know it can really sort of zap you. So he didn't think he would have the bandwidth for our beloved listeners. But a friend of the show, Austin Kocher, is here. Austin, say hello to the folks at home.
Hey, everyone. Glad to be here.
Now, for people who don't know you, how about the Cliff Notes version?
Yeah, the elevator pitch.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm an assistant professor at TRAC, which stands for the Offensively Long Transactional Records Access Clearinghouse. And I'm an immigration researcher, and I study immigration stuff. And I sometimes actually study immigration attorneys who listen to this podcast.
Really?
Yeah.
Do you think people listen to this?
I think that there are at least, I would say, well into double digits people that listen to this.
Well into double digits? We're talking like
well into double digits.
Upper teens, right? Or are you talking like close to triple digits?
I would say closing in on triple digits for sure. Maybe into.
When are we getting the official TRAC report on our listenership?
You know, that is in the pipeline. We're working on it.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very weird FOIA request. You know, we rely on Freedom of Information Act requests. And so typically those don't apply to, private organizations. So we've had to go really around the barn.
Mm-hmm.
You are, I think, probably on some kind of FBI surveillance list. So that's actually, where we've had to go. But yeah, we're working on it.
Nice. Well, we appreciate all the hard work you're doing over there. So yeah, we wanted to talk today about ADT, Alternative to Detention. But first, there were just a couple of stories that stood out this week to me. And we'll get your thoughts on some of these. So one of them, this is like a small story, but it stood out to me for a specific reason. So USCIS, and that's the part of immigration that does like the family-based applications. They do affirmative asylum applications and things like that. USCIS acts as Trump's tightened refugee marriage standard. And I saw the headline and I thought, I don't even know what rule that is or what standard that is. Basically, it turns out that under the Trump administration, they issued a new standard to, limit who could be recognized as a spouse for a refugee in order to basically limit the number of people who could come in on a refugee application. And so that policy is being reversed. And that seems like a pretty small bore thing, but I thought it was illustrative because, I'm reading pretty much just immigration news like all the time and tried pretty hard to track the Trump changes, large and small. But here's a policy that's being reversed in a good way. But the point is, like, I had completely missed this. Had you heard about this rule change when it happened at the time?
No, not at all. No. It was one of those things that it must have just flown right by in the flurry of like bullets and everything and shrapnel. So no, I had not. I was glad that you sent it to me because it looks interesting. But again, I didn't see when the Trump administration changed it. No.
And it looks like the guidance was issued in 2018 and 2019. They were basically, USCIS officers were instructed to consider only marriages that were valid under the law of the jurisdiction where they were celebrated and not the previous sort of long-standing practice of giving some leniency to some informal marriages in the refugee and asylum context. So again, it was a small change, but like the thing I've noticed with a lot of this Trump stuff is it's small, but when you meet one of those families that's affected, even though there might not be a lot of them on any given policy, it's like it can ruin their entire life. So,
and Stephen, correct me if I'm wrong, but it looked like what the policy had done was to say for people out there who don't work with refugees, there's a lot of refugees who come through refugee camps, right? And they are there not just for a couple of weeks or a couple of months, but for years. I mean, there are families, there are children born in refugee camps and grow up and people start families and get married and all of this. But it may be the case that, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, but it may be the case that that people do get married, but there's no paperwork filed because they're literally living in a refugee camp. And it looked like what the policy had done was to say, oh, well, if you don't have paperwork, you're not real spouses, right?
Right. And also, I think depending on the context, you might come from a place where it's almost impossible to get a quote unquote legal marriage. And especially in the context of refugees, maybe because like the local municipality office was destroyed or, the guy who does that in your local town was murdered. And so all you have is a religious ceremony or a religious marriage and not a civil marriage. And so I think the existing policy gives some leniency for those kinds of circumstances and gives refugees the opportunity to sort of prove with some of this other stuff, like a religious-based marriage, that, yeah, this is my spouse, right? And Trump came in, again, it's really the sort of death by a thousand cuts approach of the Trump administration. And also, I think a good example of the Biden administration doing the right thing and reversing course. And hopefully, the Democrats are so afraid of their own shadow. They're afraid of how this will play on Fox News. But the truth is, like, some of this stuff is so small, it's just not going to get picked up on Fox News. So they might as well go. I mean, I don't think they should be overwhelmingly concerned with Fox News anyways, but they should take courage and move forward in reversing some of this stuff. So
yeah, that's good.
What else were we going to talk about? Oh, the new public charge rules. So this is more an example of one of the bigger things that Trump tried to do, which was to inject steroids into the sort of 100-year-old public charge standard, which, basically says, if you're a poor, then don't come here. You're not allowed to come here. And what the Trump administration did was, they came out with a new form. They wanted you to start filing your bank statements and your credit score and all these different things to try and inject more power into the government's ability to keep out the poors. And the Biden administration has set in motion the process of going back to the old standard. So that's something that has been a problem since forever. But since the Trump administration, one of the number one calls that we get as practitioners is, I need to get food stamps. Will that affect me? My son is on medical coupon. Will that affect me? Or I had medical coupon for 3 days 10 years ago. Will that affect me? And that's all because of the sort of environment that was created under the Trump administration. So it's a good thing that they're reversing course on that. So any thoughts on the public charge rule?
I'm glad to see them reversing some of these policies. It was a death by a thousand cuts. And so it's going to take 1,000 little Band-Aids, to go back over all of those cuts. So I'm glad to see some of these things getting reversed. Like you said, I think there's so much that the Biden administration can do in terms of some of these smaller policies that, they're unlikely to all just like filter up into Fox News. Like, just change them. Don't make a big deal. Just fix it and move on. In my view, that's a good thing to do.
Yeah. And if there is one that's going to upset Tucker Carlson, like, have the courage of your convictions to stand up for the right thing, right? And don't be afraid of the potential backlash.
Yeah.
Let's talk about ADT.
Yeah. Let's talk about it.
So, alternatives to detention. Now, that sounds pretty good, right?
Yes. Alternatives to detention. The phrasing sounds really good. It's super interesting. This week, we've seen like so much reporting. I've been looking at alternatives to detention now for a couple months, just because, from our perspective at TRAC, we follow the numbers on this, and we've seen the numbers of people enrolled on alternatives to detention really go through the roof, more than double in the last year. At the start of the Biden administration, there were a little less than 90,000 people enrolled on alternatives to detention. Now it's getting close to 200,000. And just for folks who are listening and may not be familiar with it, basically, ICE has this program. It's a bunch of programs. It's not just one, called Alternatives to Detention. It's basically various ways of monitoring and surveilling immigrants that are in the United States.
And has the uptick in ADT been accompanied with a decrease in DT?
In detention?
Yeah.
No. Alternatives to detention are not really alternatives to detention. You think that if you got a bunch of people on these technologies, oh, well, there must be no one left in detention centers. That's not the case. And in fact, it's no secret ICE's website itself says that alternatives to detention are not actually alternatives. They are not substitutes for
They should be called in addition to detention.
They should be called in addition to detentions. Yeah.
Right.
Because that's what it is.
IAD.
Yes.
IADs. All right. Well, so like, what are some of these forms of ADT?
So right now there's three major forms. One is what's called telephonic reporting, basically where migrants call in and they use some voice matching technology to make sure that's the right person. There's a second that's probably the most well known, which are GPS ankle shackles. I will take anyone to task for calling them bracelets. Bracelets are cute and pretty, and you can show them off and you can take them off.
No, it's just a bracelete.
Yes,
bracelete.
It's a griete.
Uh-huh.
It's a griete. And those are the little black boxes that people wear around their ankle that monitors where they are going. So these two have been used for a long time, but those have not grown. Those have stayed completely flat in terms of the number of people who are on those.
And let's talk for a minute about these because like we have cell phones that track us. So you might be thinking like, you know, like we're sort of in a surveillance state. And so maybe your mentality is just like, okay, so you've got a cell phone strapped to your leg. That's not so bad, except you got to shower with it. You know, everyone can see you got a big lumpy thing on, and it's not the size of a cell phone. It's quite larger. And you've got to charge it. So you've got to find time. I don't know how long the charge is, but I think it's every day where you sit either with an extension cord or within 2 or 3 feet of a wall with your foot up charging this thing. And on top of that, you know, we've had all kinds of complaints about when I charge it, it gets like really hot. You know, all these kinds of things, these kinds of complaints that can happen. And just the stress of like, oh no, it's not working. You know, what does that mean for me? And they're calling their attorney, they're calling ICE, and they don't always get those answers. And so this is like a tremendous amount of stress for somebody who's not trying to Smokey and the Bandit their way out of checking in with ICE. They're just trying to live their life. And all of a sudden they've got to worry about this thing. And so I was texting you, I remember, I think it was probably around 2013 or 14, going to the local ICE office and going into this one, you know, back room where they would have people sign paperwork or whatever. And they had boxes like all around at least 2 walls of this office, all the way to the ceiling. And I was like, what's all this? And they were ankle monitors that had been bought up. I think they're from Geo. I think Geo, the detention company, is also in the ankle monitor business. And when you're a hammer, everything is a nail. And so what did they do? They started looking for pretexts to put an ankle monitor on people who otherwise didn't need one. And so that's sort of the history of the ankle monitors, at least here locally in my practice.
Yeah. And I think, you know, one of the things for people to really grasp here is that immigration is becoming, as many people have noticed, increasingly wrapped up in the criminalization system. And so a lot of the technologies that have been used in the criminal justice system, and again, not that that's justified either, but like ankle monitors, they have been gradually, essentially like migrating. You know, technologies migrate just like people migrate. And the technologies are migrating into the immigration control world. And GPS ankle monitors are definitely one of those things. They've been used over the last decade as a way to ostensibly address mass incarceration. All it really does is just diffuse mass incarceration into the community. It turns houses. You know, James Kilgore writes about this, and he talks about how essentially homes and those like intimate spaces are now becoming carceral spaces because your house is now your prison. You're on house arrest. You can't leave. You have a GPS ankle monitor on. So in many ways, what it does is it takes those technologies and those practices of surveillance and control and just sends you home with them. It doesn't actually end incarceration. It sends incarceration out into the community. And now it's getting adopted in the immigration world too.
And you might be thinking, well, certainly these people, Stephen, that you're talking about, they're illegals. They've committed some sort of serious crime, and it's going to be super important that we, you know where they are. But these are people who, at least locally, people who were getting ankle monitors weren't people who otherwise would have gone to detention. Right? These are people who just simply wouldn't have had ankle monitors before, but now they get them. So again, it's not an alternative, it's an in addition to detention situation. And I don't know that I ever had someone, you would think with this new technology, we could take somebody who we would have otherwise sent to the Northwest Detention Center here because they were arrested for domestic violence or they were arrested for DUI. But now that we have these ankle monitors, we can forego that and sort of keep track of them this way. It was never used that way. It was used for, here's somebody who came seeking asylum with their 3 kids. They're anxious to go to their hearing. They want to know when their hearing is going to be. And so we're going to put an ankle monitor on them just to know where they're at. And the main reason, at least in my experience, was to know like if they were working without a work permit. And when you combine that with the fact that they're being denied pathways that exist to get a work permit, then really all this does is take somebody who's here seeking asylum, trying to do things the right way, and say, you know what, you better not go pick apples even for like a couple days a week. You better not do any of this stuff. You've got to be staying at home. Otherwise, we're going to call you and say, hey, what are you up to? We noticed you were out and about. And so, yeah, it's important, I think, for people to understand that, because there is, for a lot of folks, an assumption that if you're on an ankle monitor or if you're at risk of being detained, it's got to be for a reason. And it's just not. It's not.
Yeah, it's just not. One of the important things to keep in mind here, too, is, if you want to eliminate private civil immigrant detention, that is going to be a blow to the private companies who have contracts with the federal government. And so there is a profit incentive here for those companies to say, well, if there is going to be a reduction of detention in some way, how do we keep those contracts meaningful and flowing? And so there is some profit incentive here, because as you said, it's the same companies that are building and managing private detention facilities. Those are the same companies that are now doing alternative to detention technologies. So this is a new area of quote unquote innovation,
right,
for companies who would otherwise, maybe have those contracts drawn down in some way if we were to actually reduce the number of people in detention and beds and facilities, which we're not doing. But, if we were.
They're diversifying their portfolio.
They are diversifying.
So the ankle monitors, like you said, maybe about 10 years ago, we saw this influx. And it is important, I think you make a good point, to remember those are dollar signs, right? So when I go into that office and I see boxes and boxes, those are sales. Somebody's making a ton of money off a nice, easy government contract for a cheap technology. But we don't see ankle monitors quite as much. So talk a little bit about like the more recent technology that's being used for this sort of a thing.
So the thing that really got me sort of super interested more recently in all of this is that the technology that we've seen go through the roof has been this technology called Smartlink. And Smartlink is basically a smartphone app that, as best as I can understand, and maybe you can help me illuminate some of this, but that migrants download onto their smartphone. And they use this as what some of the language around this is case management. But it's basically the same kind of surveillance, check-in, monitoring technology that ICE was using before with these other technologies, but that's in some ways less physical because it's not physically attached to your ankle, obviously, it's on your phone, but in other ways is actually more invasive because of the frequency of communication and the level of potential security and privacy concerns around how much is being, uploaded into this app. Facial recognition software is part of the package that the companies are selling to the federal government. So Smartlink is really where the action is now in terms of the alternatives to detention technology. And just in terms of numbers, from the beginning of September 2019 until now, we've seen the number of people on Smartlink go from less than 6,000 to about 110,000. And like I said, sort of at the top of this, all of the growth in alternatives to detention had taken place on Smartlink. There have been no really big growths in terms of the total number of people on GPS ankle monitors, That stayed the same, although certainly people swap in and swap out. The number of people on telephonic reporting has not increased. It's been basically flat. All of the growth has been Smartlink. And it's kind of interesting. One of the things I learned from talking to attorneys on the ground in some of the cities where we've seen Smartlink roll out the earliest, like Detroit, is that ICE just ran out of ankle shackles. They just ran out of ankle monitors. So unlike ankle monitors, the immigrant themselves, they're the ones bringing the technology to Smartlink. They're the ones paying the Verizon bill. They're the one buying the smartphone and downloading the app. It doesn't cost the government money, for that technology. So now it's scalable in the way that GPS ankle monitors never were. And in fact, I was just talking to a reporter yesterday who had clued me into the fact that the current budget for Smartlink technology forecasts right now, this is not like way in the future, this is right now, up to about 400,000 people can be enrolled on Smartlink in the very near future. We currently have a backlog of pending immigration court cases of 1.6 million. I think it's a very real question that we could be asking ourselves. Is this a technology that's going to go from 6,000 people 2 years ago to 110,000 people today to over 1 million in the foreseeable future? So I think this is really where alternatives to detention are going in terms of the technology. And I've got some additional sort of things to raise to people, but kind of curious to get your feedback too on what you're seeing.
Yeah, well, from what I understand, they have to take a picture of themselves, I think at least once a day. So there is some interaction. It's not just a passive app that's like, working in the background. So they've got to take a picture. And again, I think the idea is sort of to make sure that they're not working when they're not supposed to be working. And that's sort of the main feature. Again, like if it's that or go to immigrant prison, like, of course, it's an obvious choice. But what we're finding is that's not the actual choice that people are being faced with. And so it does raise serious questions about, what data is being collected exactly. And I don't think that we're probably going to know the real answer to that. Like, are they listening to conversations or things like that? I'm not sure. But in some ways, it's better than some of the alternatives. But again, it's not an alternative. And the irony is, I think that in reality, it's the government that's failed the majority of the immigrants I've seen in providing them with a hearing date and getting their case moving along. So this is just an anecdote, but it's pretty consistent with my experience. I had a family that came in 2019 seeking asylum. We'd won asylum for other family members, roughly the sort of same set of facts, like, it's a winnable case. They want to get to their hearing. They don't want to be undocumented, essentially. They want to have their hearing. They want to file their application and move the thing along. Well, no hearings for over a year. And then finally, dad is scheduled for a hearing, but not the writers. And meanwhile, they're checking in. They've got Smartlink. They're required to go in periodically. And so I email ICE and I say, what's up with this case? The dad's scheduled and none of the writers are. They're not in the system. And they respond saying, well, yeah, it looks like the writers were filed first, but the court we don't know. They misplaced it or mishandled it. And so, we'll get right on that. This is in January of 2021. So at this point, they've been here 2 years, checking in regularly, being monitored, wanting nothing more than to go to their hearing. They're not trying to hide. They want to have a hearing. And then in November of 2021, the situation is still not fixed. And so I email ICE again. And they say, well, based on the new enforcement priorities, we're basically not going to file the charging document for any of the writers. So now dad is in removal proceedings by himself, and the mom and the kids are not, and they're not going to be. And the weird thing is, ERO, the enforcement arm of ICE, will not let up on the monitoring. So I've contacted the local office and said, it looks like your lawyers are no longer pursuing removal of these people. So it follows that you should probably stop monitoring them, and we'll get their asylum application filed with USCIS and so on. And I was told by the local ERO office that no, actually, despite the legal arm saying, we're not going to pursue removal. They had separate instructions to continue with the monitoring of these people moving forward. And this is just one story, but I've got dozens of cases like this of people who entered in the last 3, 4, 5 years who have never been scheduled for a hearing, and they've been checking in or they've been tracked in the ways that we're describing, despite every indication being that it's the government who's dropped the ball, who's failed to get them the hearing that they deserve. And so this is sort of like the situation on the ground.
That's so fascinating to me, Stephen. I mean, one of the things that like just sticks out to me here, again, like you said, there's such a disconnect between the monitoring, the practice of monitoring migrants and actually using this to accomplish something. It's not purposeful. It's not goal driven. It really is just surveillance and monitoring for surveillance and monitoring's sake, completely divorced from the alleged justification, which is like, oh, we want people to go to court or whatever, you know? So, I mean, that's fascinating, but I think it does speak to like a larger observation here, which I'm certainly not the first one to make this, but there is a lot of money right now in the world of datafication, data harvesting, and data brokering, basically. And data brokering, just briefly, is just that, you know, most of the smartphone apps that we use now, they don't make their money in you paying $5 for the app, or even if it's a subscription app, you know, $10 a year for a subscription app. Most of the money that people make in developing these kinds of technologies is in data harvesting and data brokering and aggregating those data streams and putting them into LexisNexis, Westlaw, other kinds of private, you know, and those are systems that the federal government and law enforcement agencies use to track and to monitor and to build cases, to build legal cases and all of this. So it's not just that the monitoring is taking place on an individual level. It's that what we're witnessing is the evolution of a new economy of data harvesting and monitoring and surveillance of migrants. And I think it's something that like anyone who cares about immigration, as well as maybe privacy, I guess, and morality, if there's anyone left who talks about such an old-fashioned word. I mean, we really have to take seriously the fact that like the government has swung the doors wide open to private companies, data monitoring, data harvesting, and data brokering off the backs of migrants, completely irrespective of anything that has to do with their actual cases. And I think this should raise a red flag.
Oh, for sure. And hopefully it's not a ship that's completely sailed. I mean, I know a lot of us as consumers let this technology in voluntarily or because it's part of the bargain, right? That we've learned to live with.
Right.
But what you're dealing with is, I think, something different when you're talking about a population that is, for example, extremely concerned and has a lot of psychological weight. They carry a lot of psychological baggage just from, can I go work in the fields? Most of my clients are farm workers, and they come from Mexico not wanting to sit around at their brother-in-law's house until they have a hearing in 3 years, but like, I need to do a little bit of work to feed my family and to do those sorts of things. And so they're faced with this situation where they're being told, we're tracking you and we need you to send photos and we need you to call or check in and do all these things. But they also need to support themselves, and they're not being provided that. They could give them work permits if they wanted. But it's that thing of, we're going to let you in, but we're going to monitor you, and we're not going to give you employment authorization, and we're going to drag our feet on getting your hearing scheduled. And so the situation that they're in of needing to make that choice, like, well, I have to work to support my family, but I also know the government is literally tracking me, is something that I think those of us who are passive Facebook users, you know, we don't understand. We don't carry that same dynamic, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's a very different relationship to force that on someone who belongs to a vulnerable population already.
Right.
We probably overuse social media. Yeah, we all get it, right? But we have the choice of turning it off.
Right.
You know, we can if we don't want to. And if you're enrolled in one of these technologies, you're being forced to. It's kind of a Black Mirror situation, as if you were being required to constantly be on your phone and everything. So yeah, I just think we're at the beginning of something that we don't quite know where it's going to go yet. And I think a lot of the questions that reporters have asked me is, isn't this better than detention? And I keep having to say, like, better is not the right language. It's different. The implications are different. The technology is different. And I don't think that we quite know just exactly what all the implications are. But I think that we should be paying attention and not just say, oh, well, this is better than detention, so it's fine, and give it a free pass. I think it potentially has implications. Far more people are going to be implicated in these technologies than detention. The most people wherever in detention were around 55,000 during the Trump administration. That's a lot. But when you go from 55,000 people in detention to 400,000 people monitored on this technology, will it be more than 1 million in the near future? Maybe. That's a whole different scale. And so, I guess one of the things I'm fired up about these days is like just getting people to think critically about these technologies and not just accepting them simply because, oh, well, it's not detention, so it must be fine. I mean, it's just on your smartphone. It's not that big of a deal. It is a big deal.
Right. No, yeah, it's a very big deal. And especially when we know that it's in addition to detention.
In addition.
Not an alternative. And I think it's really important for people to realize these are regular people. They want to go to their hearings. They want to check in. And it would be one thing. I would still be against it probably. But it would be one thing if from 2008 to present date, 5% of parolees were going to their hearings.
Yeah.
Then you'd be looking at a situation like we're letting in all these people and almost no one is showing up. Like we need a solution to make sure that people are going to their hearings and complying with the requirements that we set out for them. But the opposite is true. Like people overwhelmingly go to their hearings, even though like the system of letting them know when their hearing is and for them to change their is like completely convoluted, right? Despite all the convolution and the delay in getting them hearing dates, people overwhelmingly go to their hearings. And we still said, you know what? We're going to solve a problem that doesn't exist. And we're going to just track people for no reason. And that really shows sort of the nefarious nature, I think, of this technology and what they're probably, using the data for, the fact that like there was no pre-existing justification for it.
Yeah, exactly. And to your point too, I mean, TRAC released a report not that long ago that showed 10% of these dedicated docket hearings are getting canceled because ICE isn't getting the paperwork to the courts. I mean, it's not the migrants who are not holding up their part of the bargain. Immigration and Customs Enforcement are unable to do their job.
Right.
So like, I don't know. It's like, who needs monitored to comply with this program?
I had this situation recently and I tweeted about it, and it turns out this is like a common thing now, or like fairly recently, that Border Patrol, when they issue someone a notice to appear, like you've got to go to court on a fairly regular basis, they're getting into the immigration court system and getting a hearing scheduled.
Right.
But they're not uploading the charging document. And so as a result, the person has a real hearing that really exists in reality, but it's not on the 800 number that you can call to see if there's a hearing. So you call the 800 number and it says, you're not in the system, you're not in the system. And if you go to that real hearing, the judge is going to say, there's no notice to appear. And they're likely to throw the case out and to terminate removal proceedings. And so I had this come up for the first time, and I was trying to explain all this to the woman who's going through this. And half the time I feel like they must think I'm full of because I sound like I'm full of because I'm describing a system that doesn't make any sense. Like, ma'am, you do have a hearing. You need to be there, but it's not in the system. But that's because this paper wasn't uploaded. And so when you go, which you do need to do, it's likely that your proceedings will be terminated, at which point you'll need to file your application with a completely different agency and not with the court. These are the kinds of things that are going on. And despite all that, the point is, I think really, despite all of that, the attendance rate for these hearings is extraordinarily high. So they're faced with all of these obstacles and burdens that are placed on them, and they still make it happen. And yet we still decide, well, you know what, we need to, in a very Orwellian way, track where you're going and what you're doing and these sorts of things. So yeah, I'm glad that you wanted to talk about this today, because I do think it's important that people understand that this is going on. And it's completely wrong to frame this as like, this is a great thing, because, my assumption when you first brought up like the numbers of ADT are going way up is, well, that's great. The detention must be going down, right?
Right. Yeah.
And it's just not.
Yeah. We're not seeing the federal government cancel a bunch of detention contracts because people are being monitored by this. It's just not how it works. Yeah.
Hypothetically, would you be okay with that trade-off? Or should we still have concerns even if detention were to decrease?
I think we should still have concerns anyway. In some ways, we haven't seen the overall numbers of detention go down, but let's just give you like a little additional point there. Detention centers are processing more people faster. There are more people who are being processed into detention centers and then released. So even though the overall numbers aren't going down, there are more people coming through. So at the end of the day, let's say it does decrease the number. Let's say a year from now, we're down to some like, detention numbers are so low and everyone's on alternatives to detention. Is that better? Is that like a good trade-off? I don't think that that's the right way to phrase it. I don't think that I would judge it in that way, because part of the issue here is that immigrant detention is civil. And so the vast majority of people are not required to be detained. So in a sense, what the government has done is they're the ones who form the starting point. So when we are grading whether something is better or not, we're grading it against a really bad system that the government has started. So I don't accept the government's solution to its own problem. We shouldn't have had detention in the first place. Why do we need alternatives to detention if we didn't need detention in the first place? So I realize that that is a more like philosophical answer. Practically, sure. I mean, being in detention is not good. It's associated with all kinds of negative outcomes for migrants. And so I don't want to see people in detention. I don't think that this is the solution to detention.
Right. It's a solution for a problem that doesn't really exist.
Yeah, that doesn't exist. Yeah. Yeah.
Austin.
It's like bloodletting in the Middle Ages. It's like,
right.
is bloodletting a solution? Well, the person is sick, yes, but you've just invented, it's not a good solution.
So I guess it's like, we used to do bloodletting by just cutting you open, but now we put leeches on your body. So is that a better alternative? It's like, I guess it's better than just cutting your artery like straight open and letting you bleed almost to death. But you're still not really solving anything with those leeches.
Yeah, we're still in the world of mysticism here. And I think alternatives to detention, we're like in the Middle Ages. It's like the mystical era of dealing with problems that don't exist. It's all very imaginary and very political.
Right. I do think like one thing about it, it shouldn't exist, period. I don't think like the tracking and the detention. I do think it's worth people understanding that even if you disagree and you think there are times when it should exist, the fact of the matter is right now, there's zero standards for when it's implemented. And it's also completely random. So I've had people come in seeking asylum with serious criminal history, and they're not placed on any kind of monitoring. Just not at all, which fine. Okay, I don't care. But then some single mom comes in with 3 kids and they throw the whole kit and caboodle at them in terms of check-in and monitoring and all that stuff. So even if you think, well, these 2 leftists, they're crazy. They don't want any monitoring. They don't want any detention. I should be given some tools. The tools should have standards.
Yeah.
There should, at the very least, be some threshold for when you do this stuff. And the bottom line is right now, there's just not. There's no threshold, no standard, no rules. So anyhow, good talking to you. Thank you for
likewise
throwing me into a new kind of existential crisis that I'll be thinking about all weekend. I've been worried about COVID and all these other things, and you've awakened my senses to a new kind of social ill.
Then I've done my job.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Austin, where can people find you?
I've got some of my professional portfolio at austinkocher.com. I'm on Twitter. I write some things on Substack now because I wanted something longer than a tweet and shorter than an academic article.
Nice.
So I write stuff on there. Yeah, reach out anytime.
And you're at ACKOCHER on Twitter.
On Twitter, yeah, that's right.
All right. Good chatting.
Thanks, Stephen.